Over the past few years, we've seen the election of rogue prosecutors and activist judges who have replaced the public safety first mindset with a very different and harmful agenda of reforming the criminal justice system under the guise of social justice. Their failed policies have had a drastic effect on our society, leading to an increase in violent crime in some of our most vulnerable communities. Today we're joined by Rafael Mangual, a senior fellow and head of research of policing and public safety initiatives at the Manhattan Institute. Rafael is a contributing editor of the City Journal and has been featured in numerous publications in several national and local television programs. I'm Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Order Police, and this is The Blue View. Well, Rafael, thank you for joining us today to talk about a really important issue for law enforcement in every community in this country right now. Before we dive into the rise in crime across this country and the causes for it, could you just give our viewers and our listeners just a little bit of a background of who you are and the work that you do?
Sure. So, my name is Rafael Mangual. I work for an organization called the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which is a think tank that focuses primarily on urban policy, but not exclusively. One of the ideas that our organization is really famously associated with is the advent of the broken windows theory of policing. George Kelling was a longtime senior fellow and someone with whom I had the honor and privilege of working later in his life. I've been here at MI for 7 years and some change now. I'm trained as a lawyer, so don't hold that against me. So I went to DePaul Law School in the city of Chicago, which is where my wife's originally from. We have lots of family out there on the west side of that city, which is kind of a rough neighborhood. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, where my father was an NYPD detective, which is how I first got really interested in the topic of policing and crime and criminal justice. And I've been covering it for the better part of a decade now, and just recently wrote a book about it, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Oh, great! And it's what a timely topic right now. You know, crime in this country is soaring, and it's something that's undeniable. I mean, the data speaks for itself. You know, in the last 10 years, we've seen a 50% increase in crime. And using the Federal Bureau of Investigation's crime data, it's showing that this year, or 2020, we had 650,000 violent offenses. And in contrast that to 2010, it was 315,000. Our communities across this country are facing real life consequences for a lot of the unchecked crime that's happening in this country. And, just look at 2011 through 2020, the percentage of violent crimes against those where the victims are Black has increased from 3.2% to its peak of 32.7% in 2020. There's a lot of dynamics that are causing crime to go up, but it's undeniable. Those numbers are relative. And often what we do is numbers are impersonal. We talk about crime going up and percentages and all, and we don't recognize that those impersonal numbers are real families that are forever changed. Talk, if you could, what do you see as the main causes that are right now having crime spike so high?
Yeah, I think there are two kind of overarching causes. I mean, obviously, this is a multifactorial problem, like any other public policy problem, right? So it's complicated, but I don't want to just kick the bucket by leaving it at that. I do think that there are two really big overarching contributors to this problem. One is the erosion of the willingness on the part of the people in charge of our criminal justice systems to incapacitate likely and dangerous and repeat offenders through incarceration. There has been just a multi-decades long campaign against so-called mass incarceration that has really influenced a lot of public policy in this country, and which is why I think we, in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, St. Louis, Louisville, places that have really been struggling with elevated violent crime rates in particular, you tend to see that a lot of the cases that are cleared involve people who have very lengthy criminal histories, people who are no stranger to the criminal justice system, people who have been given multiple second chances and blown them. So, in terms of who is sort of guilty of that, I think we're seeing this trend take hold in prosecutors' offices around the country. We've seen the advent of the progressive prosecutor movement and its electoral successes in major cities across the country. And we're now at a point in which nearly 50 million Americans are living in a jurisdiction with a self-described progressive prosecutor. But we also see it on the part of judges who are increasingly less willing to hold people in pretrial detention, who are increasingly less willing to hand down hefty sentences. We're also seeing it on the part of parole boards who are increasingly willing to release people from prison earlier than their sentences might indicate. And we're also seeing it from lawmakers who have really done their darndest over the last decade plus to enact lots of criminal justice reforms that I think were well-meaning in terms of their intent, but have turned out to systematically lower the transaction costs of crime commission and also raise the transaction cost of criminal enforcement, which is why I think we see something on the second sort of primary cause, which is I think an erosion in the morale and the willingness of police officers to take chances with proactivity when they don't feel like the system has their back. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we've seen this huge recruitment and retention crisis that police departments across the country are experiencing. So we've seen a big decline in the number of active police officers, particularly in urban environments, which is really, really important because the overall number of cops on the beat hasn't changed as much as the number of police officers in urban jurisdictions. And what I think we're seeing is what we see a lot here in my home city of New York, which is police officers leaving urban departments for suburban departments or ex-urban departments where the risks are not as pronounced and where there's a sense that your work is more appreciated. And so, there's plenty of data showing that when police pull back, when proactivity rates go down, crime's going to go up. You couple that with an erosion on the part of the criminal justice system with respect to its ability to keep people off the street when they get brought in. And I think we start to see why we're having some of the problems that we're having. I mean, one of the things I like to tell people over and over again is like police are actually doing a pretty good job when you consider the fact that in a city like Chicago, for example, the average shooting or homicide suspect has 12 prior arrests. I mean, what does that tell you? It tells you that the officers are actually focusing on the right people, but it's the system that's not doing its part to keep that individual off the street.
Yeah, I do, and I want to talk about those rogue prosecutors and the progressive judges. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals of combating crime. We all know, anyone working in law enforcement knows that a large percentage of the vast majority of violent crime is committed by a very small percentage of people. And our ability to be able to take those small percentage of people out of the lives of people that they prey on, that's how we reduce crime. And we're missing that point. What we're seeing is there are two factors. One, we're creating that revolving door, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. But there's another factor here too. It is the intervention. It's the intervention by doing the things that we do that reverses course on a lot of people. So what we're doing in a lot of ways, these very policies and the way of approaching crime is really creating more violent criminals that are feeling more emboldened and just expanding because of their lack of consequences. You have any feel on that and your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah, the central role that I think the criminal justice system is able to play with respect to crime reduction is incapacitation. We talk a lot about the ability to rehabilitate people or deter people. The reality is that beyond general deterrence, which I do think is substantial and meaningful, incapacitation is really where the criminal justice system makes its money. It's taking people who are high-rate offenders and keeping them off the street. There's research showing, for example, that for the average prisoner, for every year that they're incarcerated, 8 to 10 index offenses are abated. Those are victims that are feeling relief. There's a reality to that. You mentioned something earlier in your lead up to the first question, which was that we tend to really focus on the data, and I kind of end my book with an acknowledgement of this. But in the New York Times, I had a piece in January of last year where I said statistics are really poor stand-ins for the souls that have been stolen by murderers, from the trauma that's been experienced. Right, we tend to sort of dehumanize the experiences by focusing on the data, which, focusing on the data is important, but we can't lose sight of that kind of really human impact. And so, that really, I think, makes the incapacitation point all the more pronounced, because the reality is we don't know how to rehabilitate people at scale or with reliable sort of levels of success. And so we really ought to sort of concentrate on the thing that we know the criminal justice system can do well, and that is taking people off the street and keeping them there for enough time that communities can feel a real sense of relief, and then have the space that they need to grow and fortify themselves against the kind of crime increases that a lot of places are seeing now.
So really, this leads us into what the big issue here is, and that's what I want to talk about, in something that we've been signaling for quite some time: this revolving door for criminals, violent criminals. And look, we all recognize that the criminal justice system, law enforcement can't fix everything. We're not responsible for poverty. We're not responsible for failed school systems. We're not responsible for broken family units. Yet we find ourselves having to deal with all of those things, and we carry the burden of it. We're just, I guess, accessible, low-hanging fruit in a whole lot of failed policies, which people feel frustrated. So I can certainly understand that part, and there needs to be some solutions to these. But we can't ignore the fact that violent offenders are getting out of jail on sweetheart deals, or that revolving door, just as in many cases, walking out the same time as the officer had booked them. And I'm going to tell you another thing that we can't ignore. We cannot ignore that violent offenders, especially offenders of gun violence, who are walking out of the door, just literally walking out, not held accountable. We can't ignore the fact that we've taken them off the streets only for them to be put back on the streets and further victimized. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of murders that are caused by people that we've already taken off the streets. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go a step further. We had 2 incidents just recently where 3 officers were killed by people that we took off the streets, and prosecutors gave them sweetheart deals. They walked out and they continue their carnage. Recently, you had an officer who took someone off the street in Baltimore, only to be drugged by a car, and life forever changed because of that action. Somebody has got to hold these people accountable. They are preying on the very communities that they claim that they're trying to help. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this whole movement of rogue prosecution and judges that are not holding criminals accountable and creating a far greater crisis here than anyone can imagine.
Well, I think what we're seeing here are policy decisions that are a function of genuine subscription to a set of beliefs that is flawed, to a narrative that is false, right? The idea that the United States has a mass incarceration crisis is a highly, highly flawed idea, but it is an idea that is at the root, I think, of a lot of the decisions that lead to this kind of revolving door of justice, right? There's this sense, there is this narrative, there is this story that people continue to tell without real challenge, that the United States systematically denies criminal offenders their second chances to which they're somehow entitled. That's just not true. If you look at the average person in a state prison in the United States today, they have about 10 prior arrests and 5 prior convictions. All right, these are not people who have been denied second chances. They have been given multiple chances over and over again. I already mentioned the statistic out of Chicago where the average shooting suspect has 12 prior arrests. 20% of them have more than 20 prior arrests. You see that same kind of statistic replicated in city after city after city in the United States. And, really what's behind it is this misguided sense that we incarcerate far too much, that we incarcerate for petty offenses. That's just not true. If you look at our prison population, what you'll find is that the vast majority of people incarcerated in the United States are there for violent offenses. And if they're not there primarily for violent offenses, they're there having violent criminal histories or very extensive criminal histories. They're also extremely likely to reoffend. I think a recidivism rate in terms of state prisoners hovers around 80%, which is absolutely abysmal. So the idea is that, we're actually wrong about a lot of the sort of conventional wisdom that I think informs the reform movement, and that is behind a lot of the prosecutorial and judicial decisions that lead to these kinds of incidents where police officers are having to take the same individual off the street again and again, which ultimately I think makes them a lot less likely to want to take the sort of risks that are involved in making that arrest in the first place, because, why put your life on the line if the system isn't going to back you up by taking that person and keeping them? There's another idea, though, that's at, I think, the root of a lot of this is that, so-called that we can kind of even or neatly put people into categories of violent and nonviolent criminals, right? So you often hear people say like, oh, well, this is just, a nonviolent drug crime. The reality is that there's a lot of overlap between who commits really serious violent crimes and who commits sort of lower level nonviolent crimes. And even the most violent people are not going to commit violent crimes on a daily basis. But if you're a drug dealer and you're also a violent criminal, you're going to be dealing drugs at a much higher rate. And so, when you are able to, as a police officer, get somebody in for a quote unquote lower level offense, what the system has done is it has decided that that's the only thing that we need to look at to assess whether or not there's risk involved in putting this person back out on the street. And what we find out is that that's a really flawed way of approaching it. The fact of the matter is that people who commit really serious crimes often also commit not so serious crimes. And so when they come into contact with the criminal justice system, what we really ought to be doing is a more kind of holistic assessment of what their risk profile is. And if we were to do that, I think we would avoid a lot of the situations in which we find ourselves, in which someone, is arrested for, a misdemeanor or a low-level nonviolent felony, and then they get spit back out on the street, and then everyone's surprised that they, were found carrying a gun, or that they went on to, to kill somebody. And the reality is that we have to acknowledge that criminals don't specialize. They often commit a wide array of criminal offenses, and so we should take advantage of the opportunities that we have to incapacitate them when they do come in contact with the criminal justice system. And simply saying like, oh, well, this arrest is for, a lower level offense, we're going to spit this person out. That's not good policy. And it reflects bad science.
Yeah. And you're right. Data tells us the things we need to know. There's no question. I'm going to throw another one at you. Across this country, we have cities that are experiencing their highest crime rates ever, violent crime rates ever. And in contrast, we have cities across this country that are not experiencing that same thing.
Yeah.
Now, the one commonality we see with these cities are they're the ones that are most progressive, and with the progressive prosecutors that are creating policies that are clearly, if you just look at the data tells you that we have some failed policies here. And a lot of these policies are direction, these philosophies are done in a vacuum where they're not including a law enforcement perspective, the very people who are involved in this every single day. At what point, even with all of the damage done to law enforcement over the last 2 years, we did a course correction. I mean, these things happen. We recognize things don't work. We look at the data. Data tells us, and across this country, cities are doing the right thing. They're fixing problems that were done in a knee-jerk reaction, more emotion than based on anything. At what point does the judicial side, the prosecution side, at what point do they recognize that these failed policies are costing people their lives?
Yeah, I think what we see is a real unwillingness to examine the role that mass decarceration may have been playing in the crime rise of the last few years. And I think that's because there's just been so much investment, both, in terms of emotional investment, social investment, capital investment, in the sort of programs that have been put into practice across the country, and not just in progressive cities. We see, lots of sort of statewide reforms that have, done a lot of similar things. Bail reforms, sentencing reforms, and then of course, you have the kind of quote unquote progressive prosecutor movement that has really kind of stepped up their game to a whole other level, kind of making unilateral decisions to abrogate entire bodies of law and choose, not to prosecute certain offenses or not to pursue certain sentencing enhancements. But I think it all reflects a sincere ideological commitment to the idea that incarceration is always bad on net, that decarceration can be considered a public policy good unto itself, that depolicing has to be at the core of any real reform effort. And I think obviously that they're wrong, but I don't think we have yet seen the kind of backlash that is going to be needed for them to re-examine these questions. At the end of the day, I think a lot of these people are political actors, and they're going to respond to incentives. And when, outside of the sort of unique recall that we just saw of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, look at Philadelphia. Larry Krasner was, sailed to his reelection with, I think, less than 20% of eligible voters turning out.
Yeah.
So until there's a real sort of sense of need to re-examine these policies, which I think is going to be ultimately a function of political calculations, I don't think we're going to see that kind of re-examination in the near future. In terms of what motivates them, I mean, again, I do think a lot of these individuals are sincere. I think their policy orientation is driven by really terrible anecdotes. And they understandably want to do something to make sure that those stories never happen again, although we don't see that same kind of effectiveness of anecdotes on the other side, where you have, countless murders committed by people who, were out on bail or given probation or, just released on parole. And those kinds of anecdotes never seem to be enough. But also, there is some research that I think has been overstated that informs a lot of why so many policymakers have kind of bought into this concept. You often hear people talk about like the criminogenic impact of incarceration. People will say, we shouldn't incarcerate, except in the extreme circumstances, because the research shows that incarceration is bad. And, that's only really half or a quarter true. What they're referring to is a still growing body of research that does show that for certain low-level, low-risk offenders, incarceration can produce worse outcomes than an incarceration alternative. But that's not the sort of general prisoner. That's not the general jail inmate, right? When you're looking at assessing the causal impact of some kind of treatment like incarceration, what you want to do is create a situation or find a situation in which the decision to incarcerate is random. But of course, it's never random, right? People get incarcerated for really good reasons, and people who are steered away from incarcerations are steered away for really good reasons. So how do we assess the causal impact? What you do is you look at a population of criminal offenders who are called on the margin of incarceration. They're engaged in criminal conduct that makes incarceration an option, but not a certainty. They don't have super extensive criminal histories. They're not committing violent felonies. And then you sort of confine that assessment to a jurisdiction in which you can categorize the judges that they will randomly draw as really punitive or really lenient. And you only look at the judges on the tail end, and you look at that same cohort of offenders. And yes, it does turn out in a lot of cases that those marginal offenders who are steered to punitive judges and end up incarcerated have significantly worse outcomes when it comes to recidivism, et cetera, than those who are steered away from incarcerations. But again, that population of offenders is not at all representative of who's incarcerated and who's likely to get incarcerated. So when you take that kind of research and you graft it on to a body of offenders that's much more risky, that's much more dangerous, that's much more prolific in their offending patterns, then I think we start to see some of the problems that we're seeing. But, of course, these half-truths, they get a lot of momentum before the challenges to them have a chance to put their pants on and, get out of the house. So I think that's the uphill battle that we're facing right now.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier, and that is the unmitigated challenge of bail reform. And what it's causing in communities across this country. Could you maybe dig a little deeper into bail reform and how it's affecting our overall crime rate?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, one thing I want to say is that, the impetus for bail reform is not crazy, right? It is, in fact, a legitimate critique to say that a system that centers the inquiry of pretrial release on essentially wealth can produce a lot of inefficiencies and inequities, right? You can end up with a situation in which a really wealthy but dangerous defendant gets to buy his or her freedom, whereas a relatively harmless but indigent defendant gets stuck behind bars because they can't afford $500 or whatever it is. So we want to avoid that. That's a legitimate critique. That's a legitimate aim of a reform effort. The problem is that the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And so what you end up doing is creating these systems like New York did, in which you're not only lowering the likelihood that people will be incarcerated in pretrial detention as a result of not being able to meet relatively low amounts of bail, despite the fact that they don't pose a significant risk to society. But what New York did was it did that, and then also banned or continued to ban judges from even considering dangerousness or risk to society. And even in the jurisdictions in which the bail reforms are drawn up well, like New Jersey, for example, which is now re-examining its recent bail reform from 2014, is that you still need a willingness on the part of prosecutors to seek pretrial detention in appropriate cases, and a willingness on the part of judges to actually subject people to pretrial detention in appropriate cases. And what we end up seeing is that if you give people an inch, they'll take a yard. And so the problem is that you lose out on these incapacitation benefits, because the vast majority of people who are charged with criminal offenses are guilty. They will end up being found guilty, and the ones that are going to get incarcerated, will get time. And so you end up losing incapacitation benefits for a significant amount of time, given how long people would otherwise spend in pretrial detention. So, if you've got somebody who poses a high risk of reoffending, and they have 15 prior arrests, they have 2 violent felony convictions, and 3 misdemeanor convictions in their criminal history, and they come before a judge on a drug case, let's say possession with the intent to sell, there's a good likelihood that that person is going to get kicked under a bail reform regime and get to spend the next year and a half until their case is resolved outside, as opposed to inside. And that poses a real danger to the community. And so one of the things that defenders of bail reform like to say is that, the research on bail reform shows that the pretrial population offends at the same rate post-reform that they did pre-reform. It's like, yeah, but you're dealing with a bigger pretrial population now. So even if that population offends at the same rate, you're still talking about an aggregate increase in crime that has real victims, that imposes real costs on society. And so, I think we have to get away from this idea that bail simply exists to secure someone's return to court. That's just not true. The Supreme Court has said that it's perfectly constitutionally permissible to hold people in pretrial detention simply on the grounds that they are dangerous. I agree with the reform sort of community insofar as I think that we should reorient the pretrial release inquiry around risk and not wealth. That said, I wouldn't get rid of cash bail altogether either, for the simple reason that I do think that there is some subpopulation of offenders whose risk you could sufficiently mitigate by tying their good behavior while awaiting trial to their bail, as opposed to just incarcerating them to mitigate that risk. So, for those people, I do think we should try and release them as long as we have reason to believe, through an algorithmic risk assessment or something like that, that we can mitigate their risk by tying their behavior to the cash that they put up. And we should give them that option. But for the most part, if you're dangerous, you should go in, irrespective of how much money you have. And if you're not dangerous, you shouldn't go in, irrespective of how little money you have. And if we just did that, if we were honest about it, I think we would likely see much better outcomes in terms of public safety, much more trust from the community. I mean, if you are a witness in a case, how much more likely are you going to be to cooperate with prosecutors and police if you know that the person that you're going to testify against is actually going to be on the block for the entire pretrial period?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real concern. I mean, I've actually had people in law enforcement and in prosecutors' offices tell me that is actually coming up from witnesses who are now facing a new level of fear with respect to cooperation, simply because they know that there's a high likelihood that the person they testify against is going to end up back out on the street.
Let me, I think anyone who works in law enforcement, regardless of what role, whether it's a police officer on the street or it's the prosecution of it, I think we all are invested in one thing. We all recognize that part of our job is to improve the criminal justice system as we go on. It's not perfect. It's always there are human elements involved, and anytime there are human elements, is also always going to be uncertain outcomes. And so we should all be committed to find a better path of doing the things that we do. It's just as much as our job as it is the policing that we do or the prosecution we do. And you're right. People of means have the ability to provide better protections for themselves, and people who don't, often find themselves victim to it. There's a real issue there. But I want to talk about something else that I think often gets lost in this whole thing. We all recognize and accept that we need to improve the criminal justice system. Who's being impacted by the really extreme approaches we're taking? And working in law enforcement, I think you ask anyone in law enforcement, really it's those communities that supposedly we're trying to help the most. And what does the data show of the rise in crime? Who is it affecting most? Because I think we're losing that. Let's fix it, but also recognize what we're doing is causing real harm, irreparable harm in communities across this country.
I think that's exactly right, and this is something that it's an important thread that often does get left, sort of lost in the conversation. I think it's important to take a step back and just reiterate what often motivates a lot of the sort of more extreme versions of reform efforts that we've seen, and that is I think, again, sincere concern with things like racial disparities in our criminal justice system. And I think that it cannot be overstated the degree to which that motivates reformers. But what bothers me about that framing is that we often leave out the fact that there is a huge disproportionality in terms of victimization. And so if we are going to create a system in which the risk of victimization goes up, we have to understand that that risk is not going to be equally borne by every American citizen to the same degree. Crime is very, very, very hyper concentrated, both geographically and demographically. So, in this country, any given year, about 2% of U.S. counties are seeing about 50% of U.S. murders. And within those counties, crime is, very, very, very concentrated. So if you look at, a city like Chicago, for example, citywide murder rate might be, 18, 19 per 100,000. If you look at some of the more dangerous neighborhoods in that city, you might find a murder rate of 70 per 100,000, 80 per 100,000, 100 per 100,000, several times higher than what the citywide rate is. And what that tells you is that there are communities that are bearing an undue burden with respect to crime, and they're shouldering far more than a lot of other communities are, than most other communities are, right? The vast majority of the United States is as safe as the safest places in the world. Unfortunately, what we have in the U.S. are just more pockets of really hyper-concentrated areas in which crime just proliferates at an extreme level, and that's really troubling. But it's also demographically concentrated among young Black and Hispanic males primarily. So in my home city of New York, every single year for as far back as we have data, which is 2008, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims are either Black or Hispanic. Almost all of them are male. In some years, it's as high as 98. That's one of the most pronounced and persistent racial disparities in our criminal justice data. And it doesn't drive nearly as much concern as the disparities in enforcement outcomes. And we have to understand that those disparities in enforcement outcomes, in arrests and incarcerations, are a function of disparities in victimizations. And so if the criminal justice system does its job, if it achieves its mission as stated by the people at the helm of that system, right? I mean, you talk to any police chief, most prosecutors, although that's becoming less true today, most criminal court judges, most lawmakers, they want to reduce crime. And so, and that's as true in the tough on crime space as it is anywhere else. And excuse me, if that system works, who benefits? Well, we have data on this. If you look at the homicide decline from 1990 to 2014, that decline added 0.14 years to the life expectancy of white men. Yeah. It added 1.0 years to the life expectancy of Black men. that is a huge disparity in the dispersion of the benefits associated with the success of the criminal justice system. And I think that just way too often gets lost in this conversation. And it's something that, I've really tried to bring back through the work that I do.
Rafael, we cannot ignore the fact that there are other causations for the rise in crime. And everything's being thrown into the criminal justice system and how the criminal justice system is broken. But a lot of this is driven by poverty. A lot of this is driven by failed school systems. A lot of this is driven by just the temperature or the health of a community. All of these factors. And if we don't, we could talk all we want about doing reform and how it's going to have an effect on crime and improve the quality of life for people in communities. But until we start talking about all of these other things that add to just hopelessness of communities, we're never going to police ourselves out of this.
I just want to add something there because, I do think there's some truth to that. However, on the poverty point, I want to push back a little bit. And I talk about this in my book, but I don't think that poverty is something that has to be addressed in order to reduce violent crime specifically. I do think that the research shows a pretty strong link between poverty and property crime, things like theft and larcenies. But when it comes to violence, we've actually done a really good job as a society of getting violent crime under control in the past without really doing much, if anything at all, about poverty. I just want to give a couple of data points just to support this idea. Of New York City, 1990, we saw our peak number of homicides, 2,262 that year. 2017, we saw our valley, 292. During that period, the poverty rate remained essentially steady. In fact, in 1989, New York City's poverty rate was slightly lower than it was in 2016. So if you look at just the years before our peak and our valley, the year before the peak was actually slightly better in terms of poverty measurements than it was in terms of the year before our valley. There are also a lot of really important demographic differences in terms of violent crime involvement that I think belie the poverty violence sort of link, right? I mean, so, Black families in New York tend to have significantly lower household incomes than Hispanic families in New York, yet Black males in New York commit violent crime at a significantly higher rate than Hispanic males. You have much higher poverty rates among the Asian community in New York, significantly lower crime rates across the board. There's a really great book by a criminologist named Barry Latzer called The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America. And it's really a fantastic example just showing how weak the relationship has traditionally and historically been between poverty and crime, between other socioeconomic measures and violence. 2007 to 2010 nationally, the unemployment rate nearly doubled, yet the homicide rate declined by 15% during that time. The Great Depression, huge rise in the poverty rate, huge rise in the unemployment rate. We did not see a rise in the homicide rate nationally. So, one of the things that I've been critical of is this idea that, we're not going to be able to get violent crime in particular under control without solving these big societal problems. I do think that we have the tools and the knowledge base to do just that without addressing those things, which is not to say that we shouldn't address those things. I think there are really good reasons to address something like poverty, to address something like unemployment. But I do think that it's very important for people to understand that when it comes to intelligent, data-driven policing, prosecution, and incarceration practices, we can take a huge bite out of the violent crime problem without having to figure out how to solve some of the most intractable problems that our society has confronted over the last century.
Yeah. Great information. You know what? Maybe this is it's another topic I'll have you back on, and we'll talk about those and dig a little deeper into those. As we wrap this up, we talked about these trends that we see across the country. We talked about a lot of causation factors for it. What can be done? Just in a simple, and I know this is complex. I'm asking you to fix everything in just a minute. That's great if you could, but the reality is this is pretty dead. What steps can be taken now to, what can citizens do? What can agencies do? What could our whole system do to improve this trend that we're on?
Well, for citizens, I think the answer is, a lot of our problems are political in nature and therefore require a political solution. And so it's really on the citizenry to educate itself and, think about where it is that they stand on these issues, how important these issues are to them in their voting decisions, and then make sure that their representatives are aware of that. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I wanted to give people a, a readable, digestible set of arguments on these really, really important issues so that they can better understand them and then take steps as they see fit. The other thing that agencies can do, police agencies in particular, is, try and it's harder in jurisdictions where the prosecutors are at odds with the police department, but try and establish relationships with either your local federal prosecutors or your county prosecutors. And use data, use risk assessments. There are ways that you can identify who the sort of small social networks are that are driving, the most costly types of violent crime in your communities, and then figure out ways to go after them and build cases that are going to stick. There's a really great study by a criminologist named Aaron Chalfin out of the city of New York called Precision Policing, or Can Precision Policing Reduce Crime, I think was the title of the study. But what he found was that simply by identifying the gangs and crews that were driving the bulk of the gun violence in New York, and then having these kind of gang sweeps and gang prosecutions initiated against them, you achieved a significant amount of incapacitation benefits that were responsible for like a 30% decline in shootings in New York over a period in which the rest of the country's crime decline had essentially leveled off, if not reversed. And so, figuring out how to be more precise with the resources that you have, particularly at a time in which resources are squeezed, I think that's certainly a step that should be taken. I do think that lawmakers need to re-examine a lot of the reforms that they have enacted in haste over the last few years. I mean, we've seen our prison population as a country decline by about 20%, maybe 25% once we get the 2021 data in. We've seen arrests go down significantly. Figuring out ways to make sure that departments and prosecutors and judges and correctional systems have the tools that they need and the legal regimes in place to do the jobs that we all want them to do, I think is really, really essential. And then, another really big thing is we have to figure out a way to get more cops on the beat. There was a big infusion of funding into the national policing systems in 1994 as a result of the crime bill. A lot of those officers became eligible for retirement in 2014 and have been leaving the force ever since without any real federal effort to kind of replenish those ranks. And so we've had a long-standing recruitment problem that is turning into both a recruitment and retention problem as morale declines, as the job becomes more hyper-scrutinized in what is seen as an unfair way. And so, I do think we're facing significant risks if we don't close that gap and get more officers on the street.
Yeah, I think we're at a crisis, and the reason, and the way I define that is that bringing new officers. Well, first off, we got to get the best and brightest to want to take this job, and that environment, the environment that we've been in the past 2 years has not done the dehumanization of law enforcement has not done a whole lot of good for that. The second important factor of this is if we took in new recruits today, and even if they are the best and brightest, they are years away from being right. Those effective officers. So I appreciate your insight. Great information you share with us. I'd like to have you back and talk about some of these other issues and dig into them a little bit more. But you have a book that's now out, getting a lot of praise. So tell us a little bit about your book and how our listeners and viewers could get a copy.
Sure. It's called Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. You can get it wherever you get your books: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, hopefully your local bookstore. So I hope you'll all consider reading it. But, the book is really a very concerted and thorough effort to interrogate a lot of the narratives that are at the root of some of the more pernicious reforms that we've seen take hold, at the root of things like the progressive prosecutor movement, at the root of things like the defund the police movement. And it gives readers the data that they need to better understand these issues and to make better arguments. I wrote the book with kind of two audiences in mind, right? I wanted to speak to the kind of left of center, but relatively moderate liberal who's kind of been going along with the reform movement out of a sense of, momentum as opposed to real commitment, and get them to understand that vulnerable communities, if that's who you're really interested in helping, the best way to do that is not to create the conditions for more crime that will ultimately harm these communities in real ways, but rather to, kind of re-examine reform and be more incremental and more deliberate about how we go about that mission. But I also wanted to speak to people who were kind of already skeptical of this movement and give them the vocabulary to push back on it in a more effective way. I mean, there's just so many really dangerous and ultimately false narratives, like the idea that the police, are just trigger happy and use force at incredibly high rates. I mean, when I tell people that 99% of arrests are effective without the use of force, they look at me like I have 5 heads, even though that's what the data clearly show. When I tell them that, something like 0.003% of all arrests involve the use of deadly force, they're like, wait, it's got to be way more often than that. And it's not. And it's just because people aren't really engaging with the data. And that's because it's that data just very rarely makes its way into the mainstream. And so, this book really pushes back on a lot of really key concepts. The idea that we have a mass incarceration crisis, the idea that, keeping fathers in the home as opposed to putting them in jail is good for children. The idea that there isn't a cultural aspect that informs our crime problem and that informs some of the police community relations problems that I think we're experiencing. The idea that police use force at incredibly high rates, and the idea ultimately that our criminal justice system is racist. I mean, that is, I think, one of the sort of key motivators of people to support a lot of the reforms that are ultimately hurting Black and brown communities the most. Is this idea that, systemic racism has kind of taken hold of policing, of incarceration, of prosecution, and therefore we have to break that whole system down. This book argues why that is a not particularly wise way to go about it.
Great. I appreciate it. Looking forward to reading it. And I could not thank you enough for sharing your insight with our viewers and listeners. And thank you very much for joining us. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in to The Blue View, where we talk about the issues that are vitally important to the men and women who suit up and show up every single day in communities across America. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. See you next time.